In the Department of Federal Risk Assessment, a shy accountant was about to face the deadliest 60 seconds of her colleagues' lives. What started as routine budget analysis took a shocking turn when the building went into complete lockdown and a robotic voice announced, "You have 10 minutes before this floor is neutralized." Ada Lynn wasn't your typical government employee. For 6 years, she had spent her life hiding behind spreadsheets and expense reports, known for speaking barely above a whisper and blending into the cubicle walls like part of the furniture. When she encountered hostile infiltrators systematically dismantling the building's security systems, her colleagues had no idea they were witnessing the return of a ghost. Ada responded with tactical precision that would lead to a complete transformation of federal security infrastructure. What began as a terrorist attack on a government building would become the resurrection of Project Velvet's most effective systems architect. The intelligence community would never be the same after discovering they had buried their most dangerous weapon in accounting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Department of Federal Risk Assessment hummed with the same monotonous frequency they had for the past 6 years, casting everything in that particular shade of bureaucratic beige that made even the most vibrant personalities fade into background noise. Ada Lynn had perfected the art of becoming part of that background, her small frame tucked into the corner cubicle on the finance floor, where the air smelled perpetually of toner cartridges, and the faint metallic tang of recycled air that had been breathed too many times by too many people who had given up on their dreams, somewhere between their third promotion and their first real glimpse of how the machine actually worked. Her desk was a study in careful organization, every pen aligned at precise angles, every folder labeled with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that most people mistook for obsessive-compulsive tendencies, rather than recognizing it for what it truly was. The ingrained habits of someone who had once needed to memorize building layouts in 30 seconds or less, someone who had learned that chaos killed and precision saved lives, someone who had traded a world where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home and becoming a classified casualty report for the safety of spreadsheets and budget reconciliations that would never shoot back. She was reviewing the quarterly allocation reports when the first anomaly appeared, buried deep in the subsection marked Asset Security Infrastructure Sublevel 3, a line item that should have been routine maintenance costs but showed irregular spikes in power consumption and equipment access that didn't match any scheduled operations. Most auditors would have glossed over it, maybe flagged it for a follow-up review in 6 months when the next quarterly cycle came around, but Ada had spent too many years reading between the lines of seemingly innocent data streams to dismiss the pattern forming in front of her. The numbers were wrong. Not mathematically wrong, but contextually wrong in a way that made the space between her shoulder blades tighten with the kind of hypervigilance she thought she had successfully buried under 6 years of deliberately mundane routine. The power draws were happening in sequence, following a progression that suggested someone was systematically testing security protocols rather than conducting routine maintenance, and the timing corresponded with shift changes when fewer personnel would notice unusual activity. When she flagged the irregularities to her immediate supervisor, Jim Reeves, a man who had spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of administrative indifference, he barely looked up from his own monitor. "Ada, sweetie, you're overthinking again," he said in that patronizing tone that people used when they wanted to dismiss concerns without actually engaging with them. "These old buildings have quirky power grids. Probably just some contractor running diagnostics and forgetting to file the proper paperwork. You know how these maintenance guys are." Quote. But Ada knew the difference between quirky power grids and deliberate probing, the same way she knew the difference between coincidence and reconnaissance, the same way she had once been able to distinguish between a nervous informant and a potential double agent based on nothing more than the way they held their coffee cup. The pattern was too clean, too methodical, too purposeful to be random equipment failures or forgotten paperwork. She tried once more with Sarah Chen, the deputy floor manager, a woman who prided herself on being more thorough than Reeves, but who ultimately suffered from the same institutional blindness that afflicted everyone who had spent too long believing that real threats happened to other people in other places at other times. "I've run the calculations 3 times, Ada explained quietly, her voice barely above a whisper because she had learned long ago that speaking softly forced people to pay attention in ways that shouting never could. The power consumption patterns in sublevel access points suggest coordinated testing of security response times. Someone is mapping our defensive capabilities." Sarah glanced at the printouts with the kind of cursory attention that people gave to insurance forms and warranty disclaimers, documents that were technically important, but practically irrelevant to their daily existence. I appreciate your diligence, Ada, really I do. But we can't start a security alert every time the power bill looks funny. These buildings are old, the infrastructure is complicated, and frankly, who would want to infiltrate a bunch of accountants and policy analysts? We're not exactly guarding state secrets down here. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 6 years ago Ada Len had been part of Project Velvet, a classified program that existed in the gray spaces between domestic intelligence and tactical response, staffed by people who understood that the most dangerous threats were often the ones that looked most mundane, that real espionage happened not in exotic locations with dramatic music, but in government buildings that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner in desperation. She had been a systems architect, someone who could read institutional vulnerabilities the way meteorologists read storm patterns, someone who specialized in identifying the precise moment when ordinary infrastructure became a weapon in the wrong hands. The program had been shut down after a mission in Baltimore went catastrophically wrong, when her warnings about a compromised safe house had been overruled by field commanders who believed that following protocol mattered more than following instincts, and 3 agents had died in what the official reports classified as a, quote, communications failure. But what Ada knew was simply the institutional arrogance that killed people who asked inconvenient questions. She had disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of civilian government work, choosing invisibility over influence, safety over significance, the kind of comfortable anonymity that let her sleep at night without wondering whether her analysis would get someone killed. But instincts, once sharpened by necessity, never truly dulled, and as she sat in her corner cubicle watching her colleagues dismiss patterns that made her skin crawl with recognition, Ada felt the familiar weight of knowledge that no one wanted to hear, the burden of seeing threats that everyone else had trained themselves to ignore. The second anomaly appeared 2 hours later, buried in a different subsection but following the same methodical progression, the same careful probing of response times and security gaps. This time she didn't bother flagging it to her supervisors. Instead, she saved the data to an encrypted partition on her personal drive, cross-referenced it with building maintenance schedules and staff rotation patterns, and began constructing the kind of threat assessment that she hadn't written in 6 years, but that felt as natural as breathing once she started mapping the connections. Someone was inside the building. Someone with legitimate access credentials and detailed knowledge of security protocols. Someone who understood that the best way to infiltrate a government facility was not to break in from the outside, but to exploit the trust and complacency that came from within. The third day brought confirmation of what Ada already knew but desperately hoped she was wrong about, the kind of crystalline certainty that settled into her bones like winter cold and refused to be warmed away by rational explanations or wishful thinking. The building moved through its familiar rhythms with the predictable efficiency of an organism that had evolved to prioritize process over perception, where everyone knew their role and performed it with the kind of automatic precision that made real observation nearly impossible. Agents clustered around coffee stations, discussing weekend plans and office politics, their conversations following patterns so established that Ada could predict the punchlines 3 sentences before the speakers reached them. Analysts debated methodology and budget allocations with the passionate intensity that people reserved for topics that felt important but carried no real consequences, their voices rising and falling in harmonious waves of productive disagreement that would ultimately result in consensus reports that no one would read and fewer would remember. But underneath the comfortable chaos of bureaucratic normalcy, Ada tracked inconsistencies that accumulated like sediment in still water, subtle disturbances that most people would dismiss as the inevitable friction of complex systems operating under imperfect conditions. Late deliveries that bypassed normal receiving protocols and went directly to sub-level storage areas that weren't accessible during regular business hours. Security camera maintenance requests that followed no discernible pattern but created temporary blind spots in coverage areas that corresponded with sensitive access points. Login anomalies that suggested someone was testing administrative credentials during shift changes when irregular activity would be most likely to escape notice. She had learned to run parallel processes in her mind, maintaining the facade of ordinary fiscal analysis, while simultaneously constructing threat assessments that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic preparation for something that hadn't happened yet but was approaching with the inexorable momentum of a carefully planned operation. Her spreadsheets balanced, and her reports submitted on schedule, but her real work happened in the spaces between keystrokes, in the algorithms she built from memory and ran on isolated systems that couldn't be monitored by the same networks they were analyzing. The access pattern that emerged from 3 days of careful observation was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Someone with administrative privileges was methodically mapping building security responses by triggering minor failures that required diagnostic access to critical systems. Each probe lasted exactly long enough to confirm system architecture without triggering automated alerts, and the timing suggested coordination with external monitoring to verify that security protocols functioned as documented rather than as actually implemented. When she submitted her 4th threat flag through official channels, the automated response system downgraded it to a routine maintenance advisory within 6 minutes, a bureaucratic efficiency that would have been impressive if it weren't so potentially catastrophic. The algorithm that processed her concerns was designed to filter out false positives by comparing reported anomalies to establish threat profiles, but it couldn't recognize new attack vectors that exploited the gaps between policy and practice, the assumption that real threats would announce themselves clearly enough for standard protocols to address them effectively. The one person who seemed to notice her growing concern was Malik Okafor, a graduate intern who rotated between departments as part of some congressional initiative to expose promising young minds to the full scope of federal operations. He was idealistic in the way that people who hadn't yet learned to compromise their principles for the sake of career advancement, curious about everything and suspicious of nothing, exactly the kind of person who would either burn out within 2 years or become dangerously competent if he survived long enough to understand how the system actually worked. "You've been staying late a lot," he observed on Thursday afternoon, leaning against her cubicle wall with the casual informality that came from not yet understanding the invisible hierarchies that governed every interaction in government buildings. "Working on something interesting?" Ada looked up from her monitor, where spreadsheet cells filled with innocent-looking numbers masked calculations that would have triggered immediate escalation protocols if anyone had bothered to translate them back into operational language. "Just catching up on quarterly reconciliations," she said, which was technically true in the same way that hurricane tracking was technically meteorology. Malik frowned, the kind of expression that young people wore when they encountered something that didn't quite make sense but couldn't articulate why it bothered them. "Seems like more than accounting. You've been printing building schematics and cross-referencing maintenance schedules with personnel rotations. That's not usually part of budget analysis." For a moment, Ada felt the familiar temptation to trust someone, to share the weight of knowledge that grew heavier with each passing hour of willful institutional blindness. But before she could decide whether to explain or deflect, Malik's supervisor appeared with a kind of purposeful urgency that meant someone important had discovered that their intern was talking to the wrong people about the wrong subjects. "Malik, we need those appropriations summaries finished before the end of the day," the supervisor said with the tone of someone who had just remembered that curiosity was a liability in people who hadn't yet earned the privilege of asking difficult questions. The subcommittee briefing got moved up to tomorrow morning. Malik nodded and gathered his materials, but not before giving Ada a look that suggested he had noticed more than he was supposed to notice and understood less than he thought he understood. After he left, Ada sat alone in her cubicle listening to the familiar sounds of another day ending in the Department of Federal Risk Assessment, phones ringing with last-minute requests, and keyboards clicking out the final reports that would disappear into digital archives, where they would age quietly until someone decided they were old enough to delete. But Ada wasn't thinking about budget reconciliations or quarterly reports anymore. She was thinking about the locked drawer beneath her desk, the one that contained a sealed field pouch she had sworn never to open again, the one that held equipment she had hoped never to need again, the one that represented a part of herself she had buried so deeply that most days she could almost forget it had ever existed. The pattern was complete now, elegant and unmistakable, and pointing toward a conclusion that made her hands shake with the kind of adrenaline response she thought she had trained out of her system through 6 years of deliberate mundanity. Someone wasn't just probing building security or testing response protocols or mapping defensive capabilities for academic purposes. Someone was preparing for an operation that would exploit every vulnerability she had identified, every gap in coverage she had documented, every assumption about institutional safety that made places like this possible. As the afternoon faded into evening and the building emptied of everyone except security guards and cleaning crews, Ada opened the locked drawer and stared at the sealed pouch marked Velvet Field /Type Echo. She had carried it with her through every job change and office relocation, not because she expected to need it, but because throwing it away would have felt like admitting that the person she used to be had never really existed, that the skills she had developed and the lives she had saved and the mistakes she had made were just elaborate fantasies rather than the defining experiences of someone who had chosen purpose over safety until safety became the only choice left. At 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like every other Tuesday in the 6 years since Ada Lynn had learned to hide herself inside the comfortable monotony of government routine, the Department of Federal Risk Assessment building experienced what the official incident report would later classify as, quote, and temporary lockdown protocols, language so bureaucratically sanitized that it bore no resemblance to the moment when everything Ada had feared and warned about and been ignored for saying suddenly manifested with the kind of clinical precision that could. It began with silence, not the dramatic explosion or sustained gunfire that people expected from action movies and terrorism documentaries, but the sudden absence of all the electronic sounds that formed the unconscious soundtrack of modern institutional life: air conditioning units cycling down, computer fans spinning to a stop, phones dying mid-conversation, elevator motors cutting out between floors, the 100 small electrical noises that people never noticed until they stopped all at once and left behind a quiet so complete it felt like the building itself had suddenly stopped breathing. The emergency lighting system engaged automatically, casting everything in the harsh red glow that transformed familiar spaces into something alien and threatening, making colleagues look like strangers, and turning routine hallways into maze-like passages that seemed to stretch longer and branch more frequently than anyone remembered from the daylight hours when navigation happened automatically, and no one had to think about where they were going or why they felt safe getting there. Emergency protocols should have activated immediately, but the magnetic lockdown system that was supposed to secure specific areas instead sealed everything simultaneously, trapping everyone inside a building that had suddenly become a fortress with no way in and no way out, where the security measures designed to protect against external threats had been turned into weapons that made escape impossible and resistance meaningless. The voice that came through the building's public address system carried no emotional inflection, no hint of ideology or personal grievance, just the flat mechanical tone of someone reading a script they had rehearsed enough times to deliver without conscious thought. This is not a drill. Do not attempt to escape. You have 10 minutes before this floor is neutralized. Remain in your current locations and await further instructions. Any attempt to interfere with ongoing operations will result in immediate escalation to lethal force. Ada watched her colleagues' reactions with the kind of analytical detachment that came from years of training her mind to function independently of her emotions, cataloging panic responses and decision-making patterns that would have been academically interesting if they weren't immediately relevant to survival calculations. Some people froze completely, their bodies shutting down in the face of threats that exceeded their capacity for rational response. Others moved frantically, but without purpose, checking doors that wouldn't open, and phones that wouldn't work, and computers that displayed nothing but error messages in languages they didn't recognize. James Reeves, the supervisor who had dismissed her concerns about power anomalies as overthinking, stood in the middle of the corridor clutching a protocol manual that prescribed responses to situations that bore no resemblance to their current circumstances, reading emergency procedures aloud in a voice that grew louder and more desperate with each instruction that proved impossible to follow. All personnel should proceed to designated assembly areas using primary evacuation routes, he recited to a room full of people who couldn't leave their current positions because every door was sealed and every route was blocked. Sarah Chen had found her smartphone and was stabbing at the screen with the kind of futile urgency that people displayed when they needed technology to solve problems that technology had created, her fingers moving faster and faster as she realized that every number she called went straight to voicemail and every message she sent disappeared into digital void, where no one would receive them and no one would respond. But Ada wasn't thinking about protocols or evacuation routes or emergency contacts. She was thinking about acoustic patterns and broadcast timing and the way the voice had pronounced certain words with the kind of precision that suggested computer synthesis rather than human speech, which meant the threatening message was being generated and transmitted from somewhere inside the building rather than being relayed from an external command center, which meant the people responsible were close enough to monitor responses and adjust their tactics based on how effectively their initial psychological warfare had succeeded. The 10-minute countdown wasn't arbitrary. It was calculated to create maximum psychological pressure while providing enough time for fear to override rational thinking, the kind of timeline that would push people toward panic responses that made them easier to control and less likely to organize effective resistance. But it also meant that whatever was going to happen hadn't happened yet, that there was still time for someone who understood the situation to do something about it if they were willing to act decisively and accept the consequences of being wrong about everything, or right about too much. Ada stood up from her cubicle with the kind of calm deliberation that made people notice her for all the wrong reasons, moving through the red-lit chaos with the measured pace of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be something other than what she was. She opened the locked drawer beneath her desk and removed the sealed pouch marked Velvet, Field/Type Echo, feeling the familiar weight of equipment she had hoped never to touch again but had never quite been able to throw away. The tactical gloves fit her hands like muscle memory, the micro-drone folded into configurations that felt as natural as breathing, the retinal scanner key activated with her thumbprint in a gesture so automatic it bypassed conscious thought entirely. The compact sidearm was exactly where she had left it 6 years ago, maintained and ready because some habits were too deeply ingrained to abandon, even when the life that had required them was supposed to be over. Ada? Malik Okafor's voice cut through the ambient panic with a note of confusion that suggested he was processing information faster than most people but still slower than the situation demanded. What are you doing? Where did you get that equipment? She looked at him with the kind of steady attention that people gave to problems they needed to solve quickly and accurately, evaluating whether he was someone who could help or someone who would need to be managed like any other variable in an equation that was rapidly approaching its conclusion. I'm going to fix this, she said in a voice that carried no doubt and brooked no argument. Stay here. Keep everyone calm. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, assume I was wrong about everything. The corridor ahead was empty except for emergency lighting that painted everything in shades of red that made the familiar architecture look like something from a fever dream. But Ada moved through it with the confidence of someone who had spent months memorizing building schematics and years learning to navigate hostile environments where the difference between cover and concealment could determine whether an operation succeeded or failed catastrophically. Behind her, she could hear Malik calling her name with increasing urgency, but she didn't turn around because she couldn't afford to see the expression on his face when he realized that the quiet accountant he thought he knew had just revealed herself to be something entirely different. Someone who carried weapons and spoke with the kind of authority that came from experience with situations where hesitation killed people and mercy was a luxury that got everyone captured or worse. The building stretched ahead of her like a puzzle she had been unconsciously solving for 6 years, every maintenance corridor and security checkpoint mapped in her memory, every vulnerability cataloged and every defensive position evaluated, the kind of comprehensive tactical knowledge that she had accumulated without realizing it, because old instincts never truly disappeared and careful observation was a habit that transcended context. Somewhere in the levels below, people were implementing a plan that had taken months to develop and minutes to execute, but they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that everyone in the building was exactly who they appeared to be, that the administrative personnel they were threatening had no capacity for effective resistance, that the woman in the corner cubicle who never spoke above a whisper and never attracted attention was nothing more than she seemed. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ada Lynn adjusted the tactical pouch on her belt and disappeared into the shadows, moving toward a confrontation that would prove them catastrophically wrong. The chaos around Ada moved in predictable patterns. Agents stumbled through emergency lighting, their voices sharp with panic, their movements erratic and wasted. She watched them the way a meteorologist watches storm clouds. Not with fear, but with clinical assessment. While they fumbled with protocol binders and shouted contradictory orders into dead radios, Ada slipped into the shadows of the east corridor. Not hiding, calculating. The forgotten archive access tunnel ran parallel to the main server core, a maintenance route that most agents didn't know existed. Ada had memorized every blueprint in this building during her first week, old habits from her Velvet days, when knowing 3 escape routes could mean the difference between completion and casualty. Her fingers found the emergency release panel, hidden behind a false electrical box. The mechanism responded to her touch with a soft pneumatic hiss. She opened the gray field pouch with practiced efficiency, the tactical gloves first, thin polymer that wouldn't interfere with electronics but would leave no prints. The micro-drone next, no larger than a dragonfly, its carbon fiber body nearly invisible in low light. Then the retinal scanner key, a device that could mimic any biometric signature she'd previously recorded. Finally, the compact sidearm, a weapon she was never supposed to have kept after leaving Velvet, but one she'd modified and maintained in secret. 6 years of civilian life hadn't dulled her muscle memory. Every movement was precise, deliberate, efficient. The acoustic patterns told her everything she needed to know. The building's ventilation system carried sound in predictable ways, and Ada's trained ear could isolate specific signatures. 2 distinct heartbeats in the server room, elevated but controlled. Professional. 1 set of footsteps pacing in a precise pattern, military bearing, likely surveillance. Another moving in shorter bursts. Technical work, probably demolitions. She was mapping their positions when 3 field agents rounded the corner. "Ma'am, this is a secured area." The lead agent's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. His hand rested on his sidearm, not drawn, but ready. "We need you to return to the safe zone immediately." Ada looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time since anyone in this building had spoken to her directly. Agent Morrison, according to his nameplate. 5 years in federal service, based on his bearing and the way he held his weapon. Trained for standard threats, but not for asymmetric situations. His pupils were dilated with adrenaline, his breathing slightly elevated. He was running on protocol and panic. "You're pointing your gun at the wrong person," she said. Her voice cut through the emergency lighting like a blade, not loud, but absolute. The kind of voice that had once coordinated tactical insertions in 3 different countries. The kind of voice that had talked a suicide bomber down from a crowded marketplace in Mogadishu. Agent Morrison blinked. In 5 years of working in this building, he had never heard Ada Lynn speak above a whisper, had never seen her make direct eye contact, had barely registered her existence beyond the woman who processed his expense reports. But this voice belonged to someone else entirely. She walked past them, not fast, not threatening, but with the kind of purposeful movement that made trained agents step aside without conscious thought. Morrison's hand stayed on his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Something in his hindbrain, the part trained to recognize predators, told him that would be a mistake. "Ma'am, wait," the second agent called. Ada was already gone. The archive tunnel accessed the server room through a maintenance hatch designed for cooling system repairs. Ada moved through the narrow space with practiced silence, her body remembering how to compress and navigate confined spaces. The microdrone deployed ahead of her, its silent rotors carrying it through the darkness toward the target location. Through the drone's feed, she watched them work. 2 figures in tactical gear, faces obscured by night vision equipment, moved around the server core with professional efficiency. The taller one, the pacer, stood guard while monitoring multiple devices. Military bearing confirmed. He pivoted on the balls of his feet, kept his weapon at low ready, swept the room in overlapping patterns. Former special operations, probably Army Rangers based on his stance. The shorter figure worked at the backup relay with focused intensity, connecting shaped charges to specific junction points. This one moved differently. Precise but not military. Technical background, civilian training. Probably an engineer or systems specialist who'd been recruited for this specific operation. Ada watched their patterns for 37 seconds. That was all she needed. The military operative would react to frontal assault by taking cover and calling for backup, but he'd be vulnerable to distraction from an unexpected vector. The technical specialist would flee when threatened, preservation instinct over combat training. Ada positioned herself above the server room's access hatch, checked her equipment one final time, and started her internal countdown. 60 seconds to neutralize the threat and restore building systems. She dropped the flash disk through the hatch. The carbon fiber disk rolled across the server room floor with barely a whisper, its path calculated to stop precisely between the 2 infiltrators. Ada counted down from 3, her internal chronometer perfectly calibrated from years of tactical operations. 3. The military operative noticed the disk but didn't immediately recognize the threat. 2. The technical specialist looked up from the explosives, confused. 1. The flash disk detonated in a burst of light that transformed the server room into a temporary sun. Even through the hatch above, Ada felt the wave of disorientation that followed. A carefully tuned frequency designed to overwhelm the human nervous system without permanent damage. The military operative screamed and stumbled backward, night vision equipment overloaded and useless. The technical specialist dropped his tools and covered his eyes, professional composure shattered. Ada dropped through the hatch. She landed in a controlled roll, came up behind the military operative, and fired once. The suppressed round took him in the shoulder, spinning him away from his weapon and into the server bank. Not lethal, but absolutely incapacitating. The technical specialist turned toward her, fumbling for something at his belt, but Ada was already moving. She didn't pursue him. Instead, she grabbed the security token from the military operative's tactical vest, a biometric keycard that would grant her access to the building's core systems. The man groaned and tried to reach for his sidearm, but his dominant arm wasn't responding properly. "Stay down," Ada said quietly. "Medical response will be here in 4 minutes." The technical specialist had fled into the corridor, just as she'd predicted. Let him run. He wasn't the real threat. Ada turned to the shaped charges attached to the backup relay. 6 devices, professionally placed, designed to sever the building's connection to emergency power and communications. Without the relay, the magnetic locks would remain engaged indefinitely, and anyone inside would be trapped until external response teams could breach the building, a process that could take hours. She disarmed the charges with 3 deliberate motions, disconnecting the primary detonator and removing the backup triggers. The devices were well crafted, but followed standard military demolition protocols. Ada had disarmed similar setups in Kandahar, in the Horn of Africa, in half a dozen classified locations where civilian infrastructure had become a battlefield. With the immediate threat neutralized, she moved to the primary console. The security token granted her administrative access to building systems, and her fingers flew across the interface with practiced efficiency. The infiltrators had used an elegant virus to corrupt the building's security protocols, a piece of code that turned the building's own safety systems against its occupants. Ada uploaded a counter-protocol she'd written 6 years ago, during her final months with Velvet. She'd called it LOCKSPIN, a program designed to identify and isolate foreign code while restoring core functionality to compromised systems. She'd never had occasion to use it in the field, but she'd refined it during quiet nights in her apartment, unable to completely abandon the habits that had kept her alive. The building's nervous system responded immediately. Power began flowing to critical systems, emergency lighting stabilized, and the central HVAC system resumed normal operation. The magnetic locks clicked open with a sound like dominoes falling throughout the structure. Ada's internal chronometer told her 47 seconds had elapsed since the flash disk detonation. She activated the building's communications array and keyed the emergency broadcast system. Her voice, calm and professional, echoed through every floor of the Federal Risk Assessment headquarters. Threat neutralized, system restored, no casualties. The building exhaled. Director Sean Vickers had been awake for 23 hours when he finally sat down across from Ada Lynn in debriefing room C. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept drinking it anyway, the bitter liquid serving as a reminder that this conversation was actually happening, and not some stress-induced hallucination. The incident report lay open between them, 8 pages of carefully documented failure. 8 armed federal agents had frozen during the crisis. 3 technical specialists had been locked out of the very systems they were trained to maintain. Emergency protocols had collapsed within minutes of implementation. The building's entire security infrastructure had been turned against its occupants by an adversary who understood federal systems better than the people who designed them. And one accountant had resolved the situation in under 60 seconds. "I have a problem, Ms. Lynn," Vickers said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "I have 8 responders who froze, 3 tech agents who got locked out of their own systems, and 1—" He paused, searching for the right words. "One accountant who cleared the situation faster than our entire tactical response team could even understand what was happening." Quote. Ada sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. She had changed back into her usual blouse and cardigan, but Vickers couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed on the security footage: the fluid movement through the maintenance tunnel, the tactical precision of her assault, the cold efficiency with which she'd dismantled both the physical and digital threats. "Sir?" Ada's voice returned to its usual whisper. An assistant entered the room and placed a thick manila folder on the table. "Director, we pulled her history." Classification required Deputy Secretary approval. Vickers opened the folder and read in silence for several minutes. Ada waited, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. Finally, he looked up. Project Velvet, Special Operations Threat Architecture, Tactical Intelligence Systems. Clearance level. He checked the document again. Clearance level that requires authorization I don't even have. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. Why didn't you ever say anything? Ada met his eyes for the first time in the conversation. Would you have listened? The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Vickers thought about the last 6 years. Ada Lynn processing expense reports, flagging budget discrepancies, submitting careful analyses that were routinely ignored or downgraded by automated systems. How many times had she tried to raise concerns about security protocols, infrastructure vulnerabilities, personnel gaps? How many times had her insights been dismissed as the overthinking of a nervous accountant? Vickers started, then stopped. The honest answer was no. He wouldn't have listened. None of them would have. They'd built a system that valued credentials over competence, authority over insight. They'd taken one of the most effective tactical analysts in federal service and buried her in a cubicle because her trauma responses didn't fit their template for leadership. The individual who orchestrated this attack, Ada said quietly, used our own protocols against us. Every security measure we implemented created a new vulnerability. Every emergency procedure became a weapon they could turn against us. She paused. I've been tracking similar patterns for 3 years. Every report I filed was classified as low priority. Vickers picked up his phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. Get me, Deputy Secretary Rahman. Tell him it's about yesterday's incident. He waited for the connection, his eyes never leaving Ada's face. Sir, we need to talk. About resource allocation, about threat assessment protocols, about the fact that we buried a weapon in our accounting department. The Strategic Response Wing occupied the top 3 floors of the federal building, accessible only through biometric scanners and armed checkpoints. Ada had never set foot above the 15th floor in 6 years of employment. Now she stood in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Capitol Dome, holding a security badge that identified her as Director of Internal Threat Anticipation. She didn't want it. The title felt like a collar, the office like a cage. For 6 years, she'd found a strange peace in invisibility, in the predictable routine of financial analysis and budget reconciliation. The trauma of her final Velvet mission, 3 dead agents whose warnings she'd failed to communicate effectively, had taught her that leadership was a luxury she couldn't afford. Better to work alone, to observe quietly, to influence systems without commanding them. But Deputy Secretary Rahman had been clear. The federal government was hemorrhaging talent to private contractors and foreign intelligence services. Meanwhile, domestic infrastructure faced increasingly sophisticated attacks from adversaries who understood American protocols better than Americans did. They needed someone who could think like their enemies, who could anticipate asymmetric threats before they materialized. They needed Ada Lynn, whether she wanted the responsibility or not. The previous threat assessment protocols assumed external actors, Rahman had explained during their classified briefing, linear thinking, hierarchical response structures. But yesterday's attack came from inside our own systems, using our own procedures against us. We need someone who understands both the technical and psychological aspects of asymmetric warfare. Ada spent her first day reviewing personnel files and infrastructure reports, mapping the complex web of vulnerabilities that existed within federal security systems. By hour 6, she'd identified 17 critical flaws that could be exploited by anyone with sufficient knowledge of government protocols. By hour 12, she'd redesigned the building's emergency response procedures from the ground up. She submitted her preliminary recommendations at 0300 hours, along with a personnel request that surprised everyone who read it. Agent Malik Hassan had been an intern for 8 months, bouncing between departments and struggling to find his place in the federal bureaucracy. He was bright, observant, and possessed the kind of lateral thinking that traditional training programs systematically discouraged. More importantly, he was one of the few people in the building who had actually noticed Ada's concerns about security discrepancies. "You want me to what?" Malik said when Ada called him into her new office. "I need someone who can think around corners," Ada replied. "Someone who doesn't assume that existing protocols represent optimal solutions." She gestured to the wall display. which showed a complex network diagram of federal infrastructure. We're building a new unit, codename Ghostline. The mission is to identify and neutralize internal threats before they can exploit system vulnerabilities. Malik stared at the diagram, his mind racing to understand the implications. You're talking about completely restructuring how we approach security. I'm talking about admitting that our current approach is fundamentally broken, Ada corrected. Yesterday's attack succeeded because the perpetrators understood our systems better than we do. They knew exactly which protocols to exploit, which emergency procedures to subvert, which personnel would respond predictably to crisis situations. She pulled up a classified analysis of the previous day's events, highlighting the precise sequence of system failures that had enabled the attack. They didn't defeat our security, they turned our security into a weapon against us. Malik leaned forward, studying the data. So Ghostline would, what? Run simulated attacks against our own systems? Ghostline would think like our enemies think, move like our enemies move, exploit the same vulnerabilities they would exploit, but from the inside. Ada's voice carried the quiet intensity that had once coordinated intelligence operations across 3 continents. We would become the threat so we could understand how to defeat it. The concept was radical, potentially controversial, and absolutely necessary. Traditional security thinking assumed that threats came from outside, that proper protocols could prevent infiltration, that institutional knowledge was an asset rather than a liability. But Ada had seen how institutional knowledge could become a weakness, how predictable responses could be manipulated, how the very systems designed to protect could be turned into tools of destruction. I'll need authorization for some unconventional approaches, she continued. Access to classified protocols, permission to test system vulnerabilities in real time, authority to recruit personnel from outside traditional channels. Malik was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she was proposing. Why me? Because you noticed, Ada said simply, 3 weeks ago when I flagged the irregular login patterns. Everyone else dismissed it as routine maintenance. You asked follow-up questions. That was true. Malik had been the only person to take her concerns seriously, to consider the possibility that she might be seeing something others had missed. It was a small gesture, but it had revealed something important about his character. What about the people who didn't notice? Malik asked. The agents who froze yesterday. The supervisors who ignored your warnings. What happens to them? Ada looked out the window at the city beyond, thinking about institutional change and the human cost of transformation. They get retrained or they get transferred. We can't afford to have people in critical positions who can't adapt to asymmetric threats. It sounded harsh, but it was the reality of modern security. The enemy had evolved beyond traditional models of conflict, and federal defenses had to evolve accordingly. That meant embracing uncertainty, questioning assumptions, and empowering people who could think creatively about complex problems. When do we start? Malik asked. Ada pulled up a simulation protocol on her computer, a program that would test the building's defenses against coordinated internal threats. We start with this building. Full-scale infiltration exercise, no advance warning to security personnel. We'll identify every vulnerability, every predictable response, every system that can be turned against us. The simulation would be comprehensive, brutal, and absolutely necessary. If Ghostline could penetrate federal security systems, then external threats certainly could. Better to discover those vulnerabilities in a controlled environment than during an actual attack. And after that? After that, we expand the program to every federal facility in the region, then nationally, then internationally. Ada's fingers moved across the interface, uploading the simulation parameters to the building's testing servers. We become the immune system. The Ghostline program launched 72 hours later with a simulated takeover of the Federal Risk Assessment Headquarters. The exercise revealed 37 critical vulnerabilities, demonstrated the failure of existing emergency protocols, and proved that even a well-defended government building could be compromised by adversaries who understood institutional psychology. It also proved that Ada Lynn was exactly who they needed her to be, not just an operator but an architect of systemic change. The quiet accountant had finally found her voice. The anonymous memo arrived in Deputy Secretary Rahman's inbox at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, marked with the kind of bureaucratic urgency that demanded immediate attention. The subject line read, "Concerning irregular promotion and potential security breach, classification internal review required." Ada learned about it when Agent Malik knocked on her office door at 0630, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. "We have a problem," he said, setting a printed copy of the memo on her desk. "Someone's gunning for the program." Ada read the document with the same methodical attention she brought to financial audits. The language was careful, professional, and devastating. It accused her of fabricating the building infiltration threat to justify her own promotion. It questioned her psychological fitness for leadership, citing her abrupt departure from Velvet and suggesting that her tactical response had been, quote, disproportionate to the actual threat level. Most damaging of all, it implied that GHOSTLINE represented a dangerous departure from established security protocols, potentially compromising federal operations through rogue doctrine implementation. The memo was unsigned, but Ada's trained eye identified several linguistic patterns that suggested its origins. Formal military structure, preference for hierarchical terminology, and a particular emphasis on protocol adherence that pointed to someone with traditional intelligence training. Someone who viewed her rapid ascension as a threat to established order. "Any idea who sent this?" Malik asked. "Three possibilities," Ada replied, setting the memo aside. "Commander Harrison from Strategic Operations thinks I'm too unstable for leadership. Director Vasquez from Internal Affairs believes my Velvet background makes me a security risk. Or someone from the old guard who wants my position for themselves." She accessed her computer terminal and pulled up the building's internal communication logs, searching for patterns in the days leading up to the memo's submission. Corporate espionage had taught her that anonymous attacks rarely came from nowhere. They were usually preceded by reconnaissance, coordination, and careful timing. "Does it matter who sent it?" Malik asked. "It matters because it tells us what we're really fighting," Ada said. "This isn't about my qualifications or GHOSTLINE's methodology. It's about institutional resistance to change. Someone sees what we're building and recognizes it as a threat to their power structure." The communication logs revealed a series of encrypted exchanges between senior staff members in the 48 hours before the memo's submission. Nothing overtly conspiratorial, but enough coordination to suggest a planned response to her promotion. Ada made note of the participants and marked the pattern for further analysis. Her secure terminal chimed with an incoming priority message from Deputy Secretary Rahman, "Report to Conference Room Alpha, 0800 hours. Internal Review Board convening regarding GHOSTLINE authorization." Ada looked at Malik, who had been reading over her shoulder. "Well," she said quietly, "this should be interesting." Conference Room Alpha occupied the heart of the Strategic Response Wing, a secure facility designed for classified briefings and crisis management. When Ada arrived at 0800, she found herself facing 5 senior officials seated behind a polished table, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Deputy Secretary Rahman sat at the head of the table, his face carefully neutral. "Ms. Lin," Rahman began, "we've received some concerns about the GHOSTLINE program. Specifically, questions about the authorization process, the scope of operations, and the qualifications of personnel involved." Commander Harrison leaned forward, his voice carrying the clipped authority of 30 years in military intelligence. "The memo raises valid points about operational security. Your program involves testing our own systems, potentially creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by actual threats. How do we know that GHOSTLINE itself doesn't represent a greater risk than the threats it's designed to counter?" Quote. Ada had expected this line of attack. Traditional security thinking prioritized control over adaptability, predictability over effectiveness. The idea of deliberately testing system vulnerabilities felt dangerous to people who had built their careers on maintaining established protocols. "Commander, what's the current success rate for detecting insider threats using existing protocols?" she asked. Harrison consulted a briefing document. "Approximately 67% within the first 90 days of threat emergence." "And what's the success rate for preventing system infiltration by adversaries who understand federal protocols?" A longer pause. "That's classified information." No, it's not, Ada said quietly. It's 0%. Because until last week, we'd never successfully identified a protocol-based infiltration before it achieved its objectives. She gestured toward the wall display, which showed a diagram of the recent building attack. The only reason we stopped this threat was because someone outside the established security framework recognized what was happening. Director Vasquez spoke up from the far end of the table. That's precisely our concern. Your response was effective, but it was also completely unauthorized. You used weapons you weren't supposed to possess, accessed systems without proper clearance, and engaged hostile targets without backup or oversight. Her voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to finding problems in other people's solutions. How do we know you're not a security risk yourself? Ada had been waiting for this question. It was the one that mattered most, the one that would determine whether GHOSTLINE survived its first internal review. She pulled up a classified file on her tablet and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. Because 3 weeks ago, I identified the exact vulnerability that enabled last week's attack. I submitted a detailed threat assessment to internal security, flagging irregular login patterns and suggesting enhanced monitoring protocols for basement-level access points. She scrolled through the document, highlighting relevant sections. The assessment was downgraded to routine maintenance concern and filed without action. The room went quiet. Ramon reached for the tablet and read the assessment in detail, his expression growing increasingly grim. This is remarkably accurate. You predicted almost exactly how the attack would unfold. Quote, I predicted it because I understand how our systems work and how they can be exploited, Ada said. That's what GHOSTLINE does. We think like our enemies think, so we can anticipate their actions before they occur. Commander Harrison leaned back in his chair, reassessing. And you believe this approach is more effective than traditional threat assessment? I believe traditional threat assessment is designed to fight the last war, not the next one, Ada replied. Our adversaries have evolved beyond linear attack vectors. They use our own protocols against us, exploit our institutional psychology, turn our strengths into weaknesses. We need to evolve accordingly. She activated the wall display and brought up a comprehensive analysis of federal security vulnerabilities, compiled over the past week by Ghostline. The scope was staggering. Dozens of potential infiltration points, hundreds of exploitable protocol gaps, and a systemic pattern of institutional blindness that made effective threat assessment nearly impossible. This is what we're really fighting, she said. Not individual bad actors, but systemic vulnerability. The question isn't whether GHOSTLINE represents a risk. The question is whether we can afford not to implement it. Deputy Secretary Rahman studied the display for several minutes, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to the other officials. I need to discuss this with the Secretary of Homeland Defense. But based on what I'm seeing here, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I think we've been fighting threats that don't exist while ignoring the ones that do. As the meeting concluded and officials filed out of the conference room, Malik approached Ada with a concerned expression. There's something else, he said quietly. While you were in here, I got a call from Agent Peterson at the Baltimore field office. They're reporting system anomalies that match the pattern from our attack. Ada felt her blood pressure spike. How close a match? Close enough that they're requesting GHOSTLINE consultation. But Ada, Malik hesitated. The attack methodology is more sophisticated this time. Whoever's doing this learned from what happened here. The Baltimore field office occupied a converted warehouse in the industrial district, its unremarkable exterior concealing one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations on the East Coast. When Ada arrived with her GHOSTLINE team at 1,400 hours, she found the facility in controlled chaos, agents running diagnostics on compromised systems, while technical specialists attempted to isolate the source of the intrusion. Agent Peterson met them at the security checkpoint, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Thank you for coming so quickly, he said, leading them through corridors lined with monitoring stations and secure communication arrays. We've been dealing with systematic infiltration for the past 18 hours. Every time we think we've isolated the breach, it appears somewhere else. The Baltimore attack was both familiar and disturbingly evolved. Like the Washington incident, it had begun with subtle system anomalies, login irregularities, power fluctuations, and communication delays that could easily be attributed to routine maintenance issues. But where the Washington attack had relied on physical infiltration and electromagnetic disruption, Baltimore faced something far more sophisticated, a virus that adapted to countermeasures in real time. Ada studied the technical reports while her team began their analysis. The attack signature was unmistakable. The same preference for protocol exploitation, the same understanding of federal system architecture, the same psychological manipulation of institutional responses. But the execution showed clear learning from the Washington incident. The adversary had analyzed their defensive measures and developed more effective approaches. "It's not just more sophisticated," Malik observed, reviewing network logs on his tablet. "It's personally adapted. Whoever's doing this knows exactly how we responded to the first attack." Ada pulled up a comparison chart showing the two incidents side by side. The tactical evolution was clear. Where Washington had used brute force electromagnetic disruption, Baltimore employed subtle system manipulation. Where Washington had relied on physical demolition, Baltimore used logic bombs embedded in routine software updates. Where Washington had triggered obvious alarm conditions, Baltimore masked its activities as legitimate system maintenance. "They're not just learning from our defenses," she said quietly. "They're learning from our psychology. They know we'll look for the same patterns, expect the same approach, so they're giving us something completely different." Quote, Agent Peterson joined their analysis session, bringing with him a thick file of incident reports. "What's particularly disturbing is the timing," he said. "The Baltimore intrusion began exactly 72 hours after your GHOSTLINE program was officially authorized. That suggests either incredible coincidence or inside knowledge of federal planning cycles." Ada felt the familiar chill of pattern recognition, the sensation of disparate pieces clicking into a larger, more dangerous picture. She accessed her secure terminal and began cross-referencing incident data with federal personnel databases, looking for connections that went beyond technical capabilities. "Malik, pull up the communication logs from both attacks. I want to see every message, every system access, every data transfer in the 48 hours preceding each incident." The analysis took 3 hours, but the results were unambiguous. Both attacks had been preceded by specific information gathering, not just technical reconnaissance, but detailed intelligence about federal response protocols, personnel assignments, and institutional decision-making processes. The adversary wasn't just hacking systems, they were hacking the culture. "Look at this," Ada said, highlighting a series of database queries that had occurred before both attacks. Someone with legitimate access was downloading detailed files about emergency response procedures, personnel psychological profiles, and communication hierarchies. They knew exactly who would respond how, which protocols would be implemented, which people would make which decisions. The implications were staggering. This wasn't external penetration by foreign actors or criminal organizations. This was internal sabotage by someone with intimate knowledge of federal operations, someone who understood not just technical systems but organizational psychology. "We're dealing with a former insider," Ada concluded. "Someone who worked in federal intelligence, probably at a high level, who turned against their own system." Agent Peterson leaned forward, his expression grim. "How do we fight an enemy who knows our systems as well as we do?" "We change the systems," Ada replied. "We abandon the protocols they're familiar with and implement new approaches they can't predict." She began drafting a priority message to Deputy Secretary Rahman. "But first, we need to figure out who they are." Quote, The personnel database search took most of the night, but Ada's Velvet training had taught her how to find needles in bureaucratic haystacks. She cross-referenced system access logs with employment records, looking for individuals who had worked in federal intelligence, possessed the necessary technical skills, and had left government service under circumstances that might motivate revenge. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, nearly 24 experienced intelligence analysts had left federal service, citing frustration with institutional rigidity, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the government's failure to adapt to modern threat environments. Many had joined private contractors or foreign consulting firms. Several had simply disappeared from official records. But one name stood out. Dr. Marcus Chen, former Velvet systems architect and Ada's direct supervisor during her final mission in East Africa. Chen had designed many of the protocols that GHOSTLINE was now working to replace. He understood federal system architecture better than almost anyone in government. He had been present during the mission that cost 3 agents their lives, the mission that had driven Ada to leave Velvet and disappear into civilian service. And according to personnel records, Chen had submitted his resignation exactly 1 week after Ada's promotion to Director of Internal Threat Anticipation. "I found him," Ada told Malik, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know who's been attacking us." The briefing room in the basement of the Pentagon held 23 of the most senior officials in American intelligence, their faces illuminated by the glow of classified displays showing the scope of what had become known as the Chen Protocol, a systematic campaign of infiltration targeting federal security infrastructure across the eastern seaboard. Ada stood at the head of the room, her voice steady as she outlined 3 months of investigation that had revealed the true scope of the threat. Marcus Chen wasn't just conducting isolated attacks. He was testing federal defenses, probing for systemic weaknesses, and building a comprehensive database of vulnerabilities that could be sold to the highest bidder. Dr. Chen possesses complete knowledge of Velvet operational procedures, she explained, gesturing toward a complex diagram showing Chen's network of contacts and resources. He understands not just our technical systems, but our institutional psychology. He knows how we think, how we respond to crises, how we make decisions under pressure. Secretary of Homeland Defense Patricia Wells leaned forward, her expression grim. "How do we stop someone who knows our systems better than we do?" "We change the systems," Ada replied. "Complete restructuring of threat assessment protocols across all federal agencies. New communication hierarchies, revised emergency procedures, and adaptive security measures that evolve faster than any individual can predict." She activated the wall display and brought up the GHOSTLINE proposal, not the limited program she'd been running at the Federal Risk Assessment Building, but a comprehensive overhaul of American intelligence infrastructure. The scope was breathtaking. Coordinated training programs across 17 agencies, real-time threat simulation systems, and adaptive protocols that would make institutional knowledge a strength rather than a vulnerability. "This is essentially rebuilding our entire security apparatus," observed Director Harrison from the CIA. "The cost, the coordination requirements, the potential for operational disruption. The cost of not implementing these changes is the complete compromise of federal security," Ada interrupted. "Chen has already demonstrated the ability to penetrate our most secure facilities. If he sells that capability to foreign adversaries or terrorist organizations, we're looking at systematic infrastructure collapse." Deputy Secretary Rahman, who had become one of Ada's strongest supporters, provided the institutional weight her proposal needed. "The pilot program at Federal Risk Assessment has been remarkably successful. They've identified and prevented 4 potential infiltration attempts in the past month alone. Meanwhile, facilities using traditional security protocols continue to experience breaches." The debate continued for 2 hours, touching on budgetary concerns, jurisdictional conflicts, and the inherent risks of rapid institutional change. But the underlying reality was undeniable. The existing system had failed catastrophically, and continuing to operate under compromised protocols was tantamount to national suicide. Finally, Secretary Wells called for a decision. "Dr. Lin, if we give you operational command of this restructuring, what do you need?" "Complete authority to revise security protocols across participating agencies," Ada replied. "Budget authorization for new training programs and technical infrastructure. And personnel authority to recruit specialists from outside traditional government channels. Time frame? 6 months for initial implementation, 18 months for full deployment." Secretary Wells looked around the room, gauging the response of other officials. "Objections?" Director Harrison raised a hand. "The risk of operational disruption during the transition period could leave us vulnerable to attack." "We're already vulnerable to attack," Ada said quietly. "The question is whether we want to be vulnerable in a predictable way or an adaptive way." The vote was closer than Ada had hoped. 12 in favor, 8 opposed, 3 abstentions. But it was enough. GHOSTLINE was authorized for full deployment across federal intelligence infrastructure, with Ada designated as Director of Adaptive Security Implementation. The promotion ceremony was held in the same Pentagon briefing room 3 weeks later, but Ada's attention was focused on the tactical displays showing real-time implementation of new security protocols across dozens of federal facilities. The old hierarchical systems were being replaced by adaptive networks that could evolve in response to emerging threats. Traditional communication procedures were giving way to dynamic channels that changed frequency and encryption on unpredictable schedules. Most importantly, the institutional culture was changing. Instead of following rigid protocols, agents were being trained to think creatively about complex problems. Instead of relying on established procedures, they were learning to adapt their responses to unprecedented situations. The ceremony concluded with Secretary Wells presenting Ada with a classified commendation that would never appear in public records. But the real recognition came afterward, when Malik approached her with a secure tablet showing global intelligence traffic. "Ada," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and concern, "we're getting priority calls from allied governments asking for GHOSTLINE consultation. The British, the Australians, the Japanese, they all want to implement adaptive security protocols." Ada looked at the requests, each one representing a massive expansion of the program she'd started in a converted closet office. The scope was overwhelming, the responsibility enormous. 6 months ago, she'd been an invisible accountant processing expense reports. Now she was architecting security infrastructure for a significant portion of the Western intelligence community. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming priority message. The sender was identified as unknown, but the message content made her blood run cold. "Congratulations on your promotion, Ada. You've built something impressive. Too bad you'll never see it reach full potential. M. Chen." Ada looked up from the phone to find Malik watching her with concern. "Problem?" "Chen's not finished," she said. "He's been watching us implement the new protocols, learning from our adaptations, planning his next move." "What do you want to do?" Ada thought about the question for a long moment, considering the chess game that had been playing out for months between her vision of adaptive security and Chen's campaign of systematic infiltration. Traditional thinking would suggest defensive measures, hardening the systems they'd built, protecting against known attack vectors, waiting for Chen to make his next move. But Ada had never been traditional. "We hunt him," she said quietly. "We use everything we've learned about adaptive security to track him down and neutralize his network before he can sell our vulnerabilities to the highest bidder." Malik smiled, recognizing the tone in her voice. "Offensive, GHOSTLINE operations?" "The best defense is a good offense," Ada replied. "And we've spent 6 months building the most effective hunting network in the world." Her secure terminal chimed with another incoming message, this one from a federal building in Chicago where red warning lights had begun to pulse. "Director Lin," the message read, "we have a situation that requires GHOSTLINE consultation. Has anyone called Ada Lin?" She closed the file, picked up her secure phone, and began assembling her team. The quiet accountant was gone, replaced by something the intelligence community had never seen before. A systems architect who understood that true security came not from building stronger walls, but from becoming stronger than any wall could ever be. The hunt for Marcus Chen was about to begin, and Ada Lin was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was the shadow. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.